Hi, everybody. My name's Gary Dunnett. I'm the CEO of the National Parks Association of New South Wales, and I want to welcome everybody to tonight's webinar on the Snowy 2 project and Kosciusko National Park. Tonight we've got I guess there's a couple of reasons why we're getting together. One is that the Snowy 2 project is a campaign that we've now been working on, and I hesitate to say this, but for 5 years. And we're getting to a particular, I guess, crisis point in terms of our campaign, where we're actually reaching the point where we're either going to have a significant impact on what happens around Snowy 2 or not. And also to give you a briefing on where we're getting to in terms of that particular action, which is the sort of the legal action at the end of it. But look, first of all, I'd like to just acknowledge that we're all meeting variously on Aboriginal lands and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is running as a Zoom webinar, and what that means is that as participants, you can't ask questions during or oral questions during the presentation, but what you can do is to just hover your mouse down over the bottom of the screen, and you'll see that there's a tab marked chat and another marked questions and answers. So if you've got any commentary you'd like to make along the way, by all means feel free to put it in under the chat. If you have questions that you'd like the panel to answer, put it under the question and answer tab, and I'll make sure that we actually go through those and do our best to have the panel answer any queries you've got. So tonight it's a bit of as I said, it's a long running campaign. It's a bit of a complex beast, and we're going to do a presentation in 4 parts, in fact. So we'll start with Ted Woodley, who's going to introduce you to the broader background of the Snowy 2 project and the way that NPA has been working for the last 5+ years to try and reduce its impacts on Kosciusko National Park. We'll then turn to Bruce Donald, who'll outline for you the legal action that we're currently involved in the Land and Environment Court. We'll play you a short video that we've prepared that sort of tries to summarize all of that in just a couple of cheeky minutes. And then I'll finish off with a bit of a delving into the broader implications for all of our protected areas across New South Wales, which goes to the heart of why we're actually taking this action. But look, I just wanted to start by noting that there will be a lot of discussion around the current legal action we're taking, which is actually a judicial review in the Land and Environment Court. And it's worth reflecting on what part that such legal action plays in the work of an organisation involved in conservation advocacy like NPA. Nearly 30 years ago, when I first joined the National Parks and Wildlife Service in an environmental planning role, it was at a time that that agency had got a bit of a shot in the arm. You know, the old idea was that the primary constraints around what could and couldn't happen in a national park were defined by the legislation, by the National Parks and Wildlife Act, and by the decisions of the agency or the minister. And in fact, in that period in the early 90s, there'd been a series of court cases that had really gone to the heart of the question of what is and isn't appropriate in a national park. And while they've all got their distinct bases, I guess the broad conclusion that came through was that ministers and the department aren't free to allow activities in the national park that really have nothing to do with the core conservation objectives of those parks. And I've got to say that principle sat under all of the work that environmental planners were doing in the subsequent decade or so. But what we've seen, 30 years on, and particularly in the last decade, is a fraying of that principle that national parks are all about conservation and sustainable recreation. And instead, what we've seen is governments and corporations proposing a range of activities that have got nothing to do with conservation. And really, at its heart, what we're talking about tonight is the really unfortunate situation we found ourselves in, where we've had to go back to the courts to try and stymie a really inappropriate set of developments in Kosciusko National Park. It's something we do really reluctantly. It's something we do infrequently, but we really feel that in this circumstance, we've extinguished every other option. And so it's time to remind New South Wales governments that they are constrained in what they can and can't do in our most precious places, our protected areas. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Ted Woodley. Ted's a member of the NPA Executive. He has been the driving force behind our Snowy 2 campaign. And it's with great pride and a huge amount of gratitude that I asked Ted to talk about the work that he and others have been doing in Kosciusko National Park. Thanks, Ted.
Thanks, Gary, and good evening, everybody. I'll just share my screen to show some slides. So almost 6.5 years ago, the then Prime Minister announced the Turnbull government will start work on an electricity game changer, the plan for the Snowy Mountains Scheme 2.0. This plan will increase the generation of the Snowy Hydro Scheme by 50%, adding 2,000 megawatts of renewable energy to the national electricity market. The project was going to cost $2 billion. It's now more than 10 times that amount when you add the transmission lines to connect it to Sydney and Melbourne. It was going to be built in 4 years. It's now at least 3 times that time and unlikely to be built this decade. There were to be no taxpayer contributions. Already $1.4 billion has been injected into the project and many more billions will be forthcoming. It was going to bring down electricity prices, and Snowy Hydro's own report says that Snowy 2 will in fact increase prices. And it was going to add 2,000 megawatts of renewable energy. But Snowy 2.0 is a battery, it's not a generator. One of the myths that around this project, and you've heard the words many times, that Snowy 2.0 is Australia's biggest renewable energy project. Well, I think it might be the biggest energy project, but it's certainly not renewable. Conventional hydro is renewable, pumped hydro is not, and Snowy 2 is simply a water battery. When prices are cheap, water is pumped from the lower reservoir, in this case Talbingo, up to the upper reservoir at Tantangra. And then when prices are dear, that water from Tantangra flows back through the turbines to produce electricity. And that pumping generation cycle involves losses of more than 25%. And then on top of that, you've got the transmission losses both ways. So 1.5 megawatt hours of pumping produces 1 megawatt hour of generation. Snowy 2, like every other pumped hydro scheme, is a net load. It's not a net generator. And in Snowy 2's case, we're talking about a more inefficient pumped hydro scheme than any other pumped hydro scheme, just because of the 27-kilometre distance between its 2 reservoirs, which is an unheard of distance. Most pumped hydro schemes have their 2 reservoirs within a kilometre or 2 of each other. And the existing Tumut 3 pumped hydro station in the Snowy scheme has its 2 reservoirs 600 metres apart. So where is it? On the right here, you can see Kosciusko National Park in green, got the Victorian border down the bottom, Thredbo, Mount Kosciusko, Newcombeen Dam, Cabramatta, Talbingo, Tantangra and Tumut. And Snowy 2 is up here in the northern part of the park, connecting Tantangra, which is the upper reservoir, to Talbingo, which is the lower reservoir, by this 27-kilometre pipeline. The diagram on the left shows it in a little bit more detail. So the power station is here. It's 800 metres underground and it's about 3 kilometres from the surface, which is here at Lobbs Hole. And this orange line is the transmission line, which we'll come back to later. So Snowy 2 was portrayed as a project that would have minimal environmental damage on the park. It was using 2 existing reservoirs. Everything was underground, so there would be minimal impact. But that's not anywhere near the truth. There's a 50,000 hectare project area. There's 1,000 hectares or more that will be, and most of that has already been totally razed to the ground. And there is habitat that's been destroyed of 14 threatened species. Over 10 million tonnes of excavated spoil will be dumped in the park. And on this diagram at the right-hand side, you can see how much 10 million tonnes is. If that was dumped on top of a football field, it would extend 3 kilometres high. It's a ginormous amount of spoil. Over 100 kilometres of roads and tracks will be upgraded or built. The 4 overhead transmission lines, which I'll come back to shortly. Across the length of the water tunnels, the water table will be depressed and stream flows will be affected. There are pest fish in Talbingo that don't exist in Tantangra, and they will be pumped up to Tantangra, from where they will spread throughout the Snowy Mountain scheme into the Murrumbidgee, Murray and Snowy rivers. One of these pest fish is the redfin perch, which is a Class 1 noxious pest, and in fact it's illegal to transfer that fish between waterways in New South Wales. So the New South Wales government will have to, and said it will, provide an exemption for this transfer. And that will devastate Indigenous fish stocks. And in the end, we believe a critically endangered species, the stocky galaxius fish, will be wiped out. And then, of course, on top of all that, you've got the visual blight of infrastructure in what was pristine bush. Florence, the tunnel boring machine, is emblematic of the whole project. She is one of 3 tunnel boring machines, and she was commissioned on the 22nd of March 2022, and she was designed to excavate 30 to 50 metres per day. She is currently paused under this 9-metre deep surface depression, as the Snowy Hydro calls it, and that's 150 metres from the start of the tunnel entrance. So she's bored 150 metres in 17 months. That's an average of 300 millimetres a day. She's got 15 kilometres ahead of her, well, 15 kilometres minus 150 metres. And at the current rate, she'll take 150 years to drill that, but that's obviously ridiculous. If she got up to the speed of her 2 other siblings, Eileen and Kirsten, which had been tunnelling at around 6 metres a day, it would take her 7 years to bore that head race tunnel. And now I'll turn to the actual transmission connection, which is the main topic of this evening. Snowy 2.0 is over here where I'm just circling. As I mentioned, 800 metres underground and 3 kilometres from the surface, which is here at Lobbs Hole. So we have cables running through a tunnel from the power station up to the Lobbs Hole cable yard. And then from there, we have these transmission lines going practically due west, 8 kilometres to the boundary of the park, and then a further kilometre into Bago State Forest, where a new substation will be built called Mooragle. And from that substation, HumeLink will connect in, and HumeLink is a 500 kV connection to Bannaby, which is near Goulburn, and to Wagga Wagga. You can see the double transmission lines across here. These squiggly lines are the access tracks to the towers. The yellow areas here are the areas that have been cleared along about 7 kilometres of the Yarangobilly River as part of the construction works for Snowy 2. Just for interest, these 2 red lines are existing 330 kV lines that already run through that area. So these lines will dominate the Kosciusko landscape. There are 4 330 kV circuits, as I mentioned, 8 kilometres through the park and a further kilometre through Bago State Forest. These 4 lines will be hung from 2 sets of side-by-side steel lattice towers. These towers are up to 75 metres tall. There'll be 26 wires per tower, so that's 52 in total. And they will traverse an easement which is typically 120 to 140 metres wide, but in some areas it goes up to 200 metres wide. And then we have 10 kilometres of access tracks. This particular photograph on the bottom right is the crossing of the former Tumut River, which is now the headwaters of the Talbingo Reservoir. These lines going from here at Lobbs Hole to Mooragle will be seen over an area of 200 square kilometres, and that's the area shaded in green and yellow. And I might add that all of these diagrams are not NPA diagrams, they're all diagrams from Transgrid, from their EIS or other documents. These lines will actually be 4 times more intrusive than the existing lines. The existing lines on the left here are single circuit 330 kV lines. They're the normal squat type lines that you see around the country. They're typically 35 to 40 metres tall with an easement of around 70 metres. But in the case of Snowy 2, what we have is 2 towers up to 75 metres tall with an easement of 120 to 140 to 200 metres wide. And you can see by comparison these figures down the bottom, they're bushwalkers. If you stood 40 bushwalkers on each other's heads, they would get to the top of those towers. So they're ginormous. The underground option on the right of the screen is trenching, which is probably the worst underground option. We're proposing it should be tunnels, but even if you did trenching, the easement would be 15 to 20 metres. So it's about an eighth the width of the easement for the lines. And of course, you've got nothing on the surface. Just about everybody and his dog has opposed overhead transmission lines. An open letter was sent to the Ministers for Planning and the Ministers for Energy and Environment in January 21, signed by 24 environmental organisations and 50 experts calling for the lines to be underground. The Labor Party, the Greens and most of the opposition parties and independents have called for the lines to be underground. And the submissions to the Transgrid EIS, there were no submissions that supported the project. New overhead transmission lines were prohibited in the 2006 Kosciusko Plan of Management. And you can see that here in clause 12.6.1, where it says that we require all additional telecommunication and transmission lines to be located underground. And the Plan of Management went even further in clause 4, where it said that existing lines shall be rationalised, underground or rerouted. So that was the Plan of Management, and that's how it stood up until the end of last year. But the ever helpful New South Wales government amended that Plan of Management, or drafted an amendment and then approved an amendment where clause 12.6.1.6 now states require all additional telecommunication and transmission lines to be located underground, except those constructed as part of the Snowy 2 project. So for some unfathomable reason, Snowy 2 are allowed to build overhead transmission lines through the park, but no one else. The only reason for going overhead clearly is that Snowy Hydro will save the extra cost of undergrounding. But in our view, Snowy Hydro knew the rules. They should have factored underground transmission in the business case, and it was arrogant not to do so. And the National Parks and Wildlife Service has been totally complicit in allowing the overhead transmission lines and drafting and then recommending the approval of that amendment. And this is an extract from the Snowy 2 EIS produced by Transgrid, which says that Transgrid has consulted with the NPWS, who advised that the Kosciusko National Park Plan of Management would be amended in due course to reflect the requirement to connect Snowy 2 to the grid via an overhead transmission connection. And this is despite the fact that the Plan of Management says that is prohibited. We argue that Snowy 2 is an underground project. The got a power station underground. There's 40 kilometres of tunnels. The 3 kilometre connection to the surface is underground. There are other electricity lines and other services that are underground as part of the project. So why not also underground the overhead, the transmission lines? We can go into this later if you wish, but underground cables do have advantages. Far less environmental impact, obviously. No visual light, particularly if they're in tunnels. Less outages, no exposure to bushfires, lightning strikes or wild weather. And we're finding that internationally underground is the norm, and certainly in places of exceptional beauty and value, such as a national park. The last overhead line to be built in Kosciusko National Park was in 1967, and the last overhead line to be built through any New South Wales National Park was 1976, nearly 50 years ago. So at this point, I'll hand over to Bruce.
Good evening, everybody. For those who don't know me, my name's Bruce Donald. I'm a lawyer of far too many years standing. My background includes periods as a commercial and mercantile lawyer, then a period working in Indigenous land rights law, followed by time at the ABC. And then in my most recent years, my practice has involved a substantial amount of environment law and planning law. For the last 4 or 5 years, I've been on a pro bono basis assisting the National Parks Association review the various elements of possible legal remedy against the Snowy 2 project. The first thing I do want to remind everybody about environmental law is that unfortunately it's process law. It's very seldom substance law. And what I mean by that is the ultimate decisions are left to ministers and to Parliament to make decisions. The role of law is to insist that the law be properly complied with and that the processes for making those decisions, taking into account the proper considerations, are complied with. Some years ago, NPA, on the advice of myself, supported by senior counsel, saw there was a basis perhaps to bring a case against the whole EIS for its failure to have considered feasible alternatives, failure to have considered the cumulative impact of the park, of the project, and also failure to consider the application of other laws. We commenced proceedings in the Land Environment Court, which unfortunately had to involve joining Snowy Hydro as well, but the cost potential of that case defeated NPA, and the board, on my advice, decided that it had to discontinue that case. That then moved to the phase of the transmission line process. And on this occasion, the advice that we developed was, again, we believe there was a failure of proper process, a failure of the department to comply with the requirements of the National Parks and Wildlife Act for amending a plan of management. At that point, again, we were able to obtain the advice of senior counsel, Mr. Michael Hall of senior counsel, and he confirmed the opinion that I'd reached, which was that there had been a failure of proper process in the formulation of the amendment and the preparation of the amendment to the plan of management. The advice that we gave was that that error flowed through to invalidate the ultimate decision by the minister to approve the amendment to the plan of management, which Ted had roughly outlined to you before. So I'll get Ted to pop up quickly the first slide, if you can, Ted. Okay, so this case, as I say, is about the processes followed by the department and ultimately the minister in approving an amendment to the plan of management to change the 50-year policy and to apply, just in the case of the Snowy 2 project, a right to put an overhead transmission line in a national park. That's all we are challenging in this case. We are not, as I said, challenging the broader project. We endeavoured to do that, but were defeated by the legal costs. I'll come back to costs later, but briefly, the reason we were able to make a decision to continue in this case was twofold. One, the particular timing did not require us to join also Transgrid or Snowy Hydro in the case, just the minister. That put a lid on costs. But secondly, and most importantly, we applied for what is called in environment planning law a protective costs order. There's provision in the Environment Protection and Assessment Act for protective costs orders to be made, and in the Land and Environment Court Act, whereby a public interest group such as NPA can get an order limiting the costs to which it's exposed in the case. And I'll come back to that later. We achieved that, and that is why we've now proceeded to file and seek an order that there was a failure of process. And the failure of process begins right at the beginning, where in amending a plan of management or preparing a plan, or indeed amending it, the Secretary must cause the plan of management to be prepared. And the plan of management, for all purposes of this discussion, includes an amendment to a plan of management by other provisions of the Act. So that's the starting point, that at the time of preparing the amendment, then it's the Secretary must take action to ensure certain things are done. So I'll ask Ted now to put up the next slide, because this is crucial. You'll see there it says in section 72AA that the following matters are to be taken into consideration in the preparation of a plan of management for land reserved under the Act. Some 23 principles, which will all be well recognised by all of you in this webinar, that go to the heart of what the values of national parks are. Those matters are, quotes, to be taken into consideration in the preparation of the amendment of the plan of management. And then what follows from the consideration of all of those matters is that results in a plan of management, which is then put out for public exhibition, and a whole process follows from that. I'll ask Ted to go to the next slide. When the plan of management is prepared, in other words, after all those matters are taken into consideration, then the responsible authority, in this case, again, the Secretary, must give notice of the preparation of the plan. In other words, notice is given to the public that begins a public and a committee-based consultation process for considering that plan of management. And this goes to the heart of the case that we've brought before the Land and Environment Court, because the form of the plan of management, the amendment to the plan of management published in February of 2021, simply put forward that they were going to amend the plan of management. It made no reference at all to any of those 23 matters having been considered. They just were simply not mentioned. The section 72A itself wasn't even mentioned in the amendment of the plan of management as published for public consideration. We then formed the view, and Senior Counsel Michael Hall agreed with our view that that was a failure of process, that the time at which the 23 matters need to be taken into consideration is at the time of preparation of the plan, which happens before it goes out for public consultation and consultation by the Regional Advisory Committee under the Act and the State Advisory Committee as well, all going up to the Minister to make a decision. Now, of course, as in all legal matters, the other argument, the contrary argument, which of course is put back against this by the government, is that no, the concept of the preparation of a plan of management continues right up to the time at which the Minister makes the final decision. And that's basically the case that's put against us. Secondly, they say that they gave a lot of consideration even before February 21 to the matters in section 72A, even if it wasn't mentioned. So what we did was we put in a GIPA, that's a Freedom of Information Act request, said, okay, show us all of the documentation of the consideration that you gave to these matters. The response to the GIPA was very telling. There's not a single document that tabulates the consideration of those matters. was produced under the Freedom of Information production. On that basis, we felt reasonably strong that we had a good and arguable case that the failure to provide that information to the public and the assessment by the government of the impact of the project on all of those 23 matters was fatal to what then happened. So we began the case in the Land and Environment Court, and on the first day, I think it was fairly clear that we're before the Chief Judge Brian Preston, who's a well-regarded environmental judge, who's very fair and but very loyally. We believe that he took our argument very well. The government's response, of course, through its counsel, is that no, the matters can be taken into consideration at any time, and it follows from that that the government case is that the public are not to be informed about the consideration given by the government to those matters. So now we're in a situation where the case has been paused because the court needed further evidence on the delegated authority to commence the whole process in the first place, and we'll be back in court on the 11th of September. I'm reasonably hopeful that there'll be some basis for success in the case, but we'll have to wait for the final addresses. So what would happen if we were successful? Well, again, this goes back to my opening point that environment law is process law, not substance law. It would invalidate the minister's decision and require the minister to begin the process again. Why then did we take the case if the minister has to go back through the process? And the reason was, you'll have seen in Ted's previous slide, that before the change of government, the Labor Party had supported the idea of undergrounding transmission lines. And it was believed that, therefore, if we took this case, we would get a political opportunity, if we won the case, to go back to the minister and say, okay, start all over again, and we will convince you this time that you should, as the new minister, put these power lines underground, for all the reasons that Ted has carefully outlined to you tonight. What we cannot achieve is the court making the decision that the lines must be undergrounded. As I said, those are ultimately discretionary decisions by a minister that are left to the political process, not the legal process. So that is what would happen if we won the case. If we don't win the case, then the decision will stand, and then the issue of costs will be determined. Even if we do win the case, the issue of costs is very important, and that is why we are presenting to you today, because win or lose, the National Parks Association will be exposed to costs which can't be recovered from the other side. And the principal reason is this, that to have succeeded in getting a protective costs order, the advice that we had from the solicitor who's been retained by the National Parks Association and by counsel, Mr. Hall, was that you really have to offer that you will bear your own costs up to the same level for which you seek protection against costs on the other side. Bear in mind that a case of this nature had the potential to involve costs of well over $100,000 against us if we were unsuccessful. That is why we sought a protective costs order and succeeded in limiting the exposure of the NPA to a costs order against us of $20,000. But the quid pro quo was that we had to agree, we felt we had to agree to achieve that order, that similarly, that even if we are successful, that the NPA will only recover $20,000 in costs. Now, notwithstanding the pro bono work that we've been able to do over many years for the NPA, to take a case like this, you do have to move into meeting some degree of costs of your own support team. The counsel we have, Mr. Hall, has agreed to run the case at a reduced fee, on a reduced fee basis, but not entirely pro bono. And because it was necessary to have a properly equipped litigating law firm, manage the case. It was necessary to retain solicitors as well. My practice wasn't set up to do that, unfortunately. So again, that involves costs, but again, we've been able to obtain that from a law firm, Story and Goff, who are providing their advice on a reduced fee basis. But taking those potential costs into account, we are still looking at probably up to about $70,000 to $80,000 worth of unrecoverable costs, even if we are successful against the minister. Well, that may be reduced by some $20,000 if we have an order for costs within the protective costs order limits. But nevertheless, the NPA still is facing a very substantial amount of money that must be raised to meet the costs of this case, even if we are successful. So that is why it's important for donors to the NPA to be willing to make some contributions. Some have been promised already, but the purpose of this webinar is to encourage some further donations. In due course, I'll be able to take some questions, but I think I'll pause at that point because I don't want to run the webinar out of time.
Thanks, Bruce. And look, at the very start of this webinar, I talked to Ted being the driving force behind the campaign. I must also acknowledge the extraordinary contributions and generosity of Bruce and Michael Hall, Senior Counsel in particular. Bruce has been, if not the driving force, has certainly been the brains trust of this campaign, and we simply wouldn't be where we are without his expertise and generosity in helping NPA. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in getting support from the Environmental Defender's Office, but Bruce was an absolute champion in stepping into that space. Look, before we go to the video, I just actually want to take a moment to weave together a couple of elements from Ted and Bruce's presentations. One is to really emphasize that NPA has had real concerns about the impacts of the entire Snowy 2 project on Kosciusko National Park. That's absolutely true. And much of what Ted was talking about really goes back to the original exploratory works and main works environmental impact statements. But we also recognized early in the piece that there was one element of the entire project which to some extent was discretionary, and that element related to how you got the power out of that new underground power station. And that's that question of whether you build a transmission connection that goes underground with minimal environmental impact or overhead with really substantial environmental impact. And because we also knew that, in fact, the underground option was mandated by the existing plan of management, we were scrutinising what came out of that amendment process to the plan of management. And our expectation was that given that the previous plan of management expressly prohibited new overhead transmission for the reasons that that Kosciusko has been so impacted by the clearance from previous generations of transmission that you just couldn't afford to keep slicing and dicing the park, that there was going to have to be a really major argument in that plan of management amendment that justified why you would possibly overturn that well-credentialed, incredibly necessary prohibition. And instead, we got nothing. What we got was an amendment that just said in bold terms, we're doing it. And so that really took us to the point of, we have to do something about this. This is so unacceptable. If governments got to the point where they won't even provide a rational argument for why they're trashing a national park in this fashion, we have to take action. So I just wanted to really emphasize that the transmission connection really was the point that tipped us entirely into the space where we had to contest government's decision. We just couldn't use the normal standard gentlemanly type processes of submissions on EISs, etc. We had to take this to, its legal extreme. Okay, now we'll just quickly play the video we've prepared. just to let everyone know that these videos are a little bit clunky when you put them on Zoom. So we'll also provide you with the link to get the clean copy of it straight off our website. And Sam's going to put that in under the chat. But hopefully the current one that we're about to show you won't be too clunky. Just imagine it much smoother than it's going to look on Zoom. Okay, Ted, are you going to kick that off or Sam?
I'll kick it off. So I'm just going to share now and play the video. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. And as I say, we'll be providing everybody with the link to that video. And I'd like to express my thanks to James Sherwood, who's one of NPA's campaigners and videographer extraordinaire, for his skill in pulling together that presentation. Look, we do want to get to the questions in just a couple of minutes, but I want to take a very short moment to talk about some of the broader implications of what's going on down in Kosciusko. The first of which, I guess, is the bleeding obvious one, which is really about the extent to which this sets a precedent. As Ted indicated, it's been more than 50 years since an overhead transmission line has been built in the New South Wales National Park. And 50 years ago, when that line between Mount Piper went across the Blue Mountains to connect to Sydney, it's absolutely true that overhead was the standard construction technique. It was what was available. We've come along half a century since then. The rest of the world has recognised that if you're going to traverse areas of high environmental or community significance, that there's a trio of underground options. You can trench, you can do directional drills, or you can build tunnels to go under those areas of high significance rather than over the top. Yes, it's more expensive, but it is the balance that we need to make between environmental impact and community benefit that comes from those transmission lines. Here we are in Australia in 2021, when this component of the project was instigated. We'd already had a study from ANU that indicated there were more than 20,000 potential sites for pumped hydro along the east coast of Australia, including many thousands of potential pumped hydro opportunities in New South Wales. And where did the Commonwealth and New South Wales government agree that the one big pumped hydro project would be? In the middle of our most precious Alpine National Park. We have to make sure that the public lands, that lands of conservation significance, do not become the easy alternative for locating transmission connections. I'm sure you've all heard about some of the really intense community debates around HumeLink in particular, but also some of the other transmission projects across the country. No one wants them on their lands. We understand that, but we can't allow a situation where going through national parks and other protected areas becomes the cheap default. Despite the fact that this project was approved by the former government, one glimmer of hope that we've been able to extract out of this is that the current Environment Minister, Penny Sharp, instigated an inquiry in the New South Wales Legislative Council specifically into the feasibility of putting the new transmission connections to the renewable energy zones underground. Ted and I and other conservation activists have presented to that inquiry, and I think it's a strong sign that there's an alternative way. But Snowy 2 for us is a line in the sand that we just couldn't see being breached. So that's one aspect. We can't afford for this to be established as a precedent that, going back to last century's technology, overhead transmission is acceptable in these areas of exceptional conservation significance, is acceptable in those areas. The second issue is a little bit more conceptual, I guess, but in a lot of ways, it's the more, equally profoundly disturbing one for protected areas. And that's what actually happened when the New South Wales government said, don't worry about the plan and management, it's okay. You don't have to, that's not an impediment. And they put their hand on their heart and said, it's okay because we'll do an assessment under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act. And that was an EIS, which was prepared for the transmission connection. It was prepared under a designation of critical state significant infrastructure, which means that there's essentially no rights of appeal for third parties such as NPA. And the assertion was that would do the job of figuring out whether it was acceptable or not to have this scale of impact on Kosciusko National Park. And that's a proposition we all need to vociferously reject. The idea that the development approval processes under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act are fit for purpose in protected areas is a nonsense. The plan and management, you saw those 72 AA matters that Bruce put up, and a huge part of those is really about protecting the ecological integrity of large natural landscapes and the ecosystem processes that drive the special values of those areas. The plan and management is a device to actually look at those landscapes in a holistic way and ask questions about, in the very long term, for this place to retain its ecological and environmental character into the next generation, into the next century, what can we allow to happen or not happen? In contrast, an assessment under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act says, can you afford to give up the footprint affected by this block of concrete? EPA Act assessment processes are designed for coal mines, they're designed for residential developments, but they are certainly not the place to deal with the complexities of how you keep a national park alive and functional. The EPA Act is hopeless for considering cumulative impacts. It's hopeless for dealing with the regional context of development. If we're to accept that any development is acceptable in a national park as long as it can get approval under the New South Wales Environmental Planning and Assessment Act, we might as well give up on our protected area network. This is an extraordinarily dangerous pathway, and unfortunately, this Snowy 2 transmission connection is not the only place it's been signalled in New South Wales. We've also got a massive intensification of resort development in Kosciusko that's been approved under a thing called the Snowy Mountains Master Plan, which was a John Barilaro exercise designed to increase the size of the resorts and the economic and commercial activities in those resorts. It is just as important that we confront this concept that EPA Act approvals are okay in our protected areas in lieu of strong plan and management processes, as it is to deal with this question of the transmission connection. And it's one of the reasons why we've been so determined in this legal action, because there is several really key principles that apply to the long-term survival of our protected area network that's at stake here. So look, I'm going to take a breath. As you can see, this has been a really major project for NPA, and we consider it as one of those turning points in the future of protected areas in New South Wales. It really is that important. As Bruce says, once you actually delve down into a legal action, it all turns on, particular turns of the parliamentary council's drafting of legislation. That's just the way that game is played. But the principles that sit under it are really important. So look, I want to thank everyone who's been involved, and now we'll just have a quick look at some of the comments, and I'm going to relay those to my partners on the panel. Andy Spates made a couple of comments on the importance of the karst features and karst landforms in the Lobbs Hole area. Question from Chris King about the EDO, the Environmental Defenders Office. Look, perhaps I can address that one. We did actually.
I'm happy to.
Oh, okay. Yeah, go for it, Bruce. Yep. Okay,
very quickly. Of course, the very first port of call for NPA was the Environmental Defenders Office. I myself, in previous years, have been a chair of the Environment Defenders Office and a great supporter of it. They did provide some advice at the beginning, but as the matter developed, they considered that it was not a sort of case they were prepared to litigate. That was the in respect of the very first proceedings that we took. We had to, again, hire separate lawyers to do that. And they were also unwilling to take the transmission line case on, I think believing that politically it was much less likely that there'd be a result even if the case was winnable, and they weren't convinced with the strength of the argument that we had developed. So the EDO is not available. Another line of questioning today is to the question of substance rather than process. A number of questioners have asked, why can't we challenge the merits? Well, the simple fact is, as I said, in this particular area, the merits are not for a court. The merits ultimately are for a minister, provided the processes set out in the law are properly complied with. So there's no scope to take the merits to the court. You can only take the process to the court. It's quite important, I think, for people to understand that.
And Bruce, another question to you from Lynn, which hinges around that question of the reference in the Act to the Secretary and the question about whether, does that really just mean, you know, NPWS or the Department of Environment and Planning? And is that important in our case, I guess, is the implication.
The Secretary in question is the Secretary of the Department of Planning and Environment. I think the previous manifestation was called DPIE, the Department of Planning in Industry and Environment being pushed down to the bottom of the pile again. But that is the official head of department in whom is reposed the obligation to do those things. Heads of department, of course, delegate their powers to their officers to do so. And the argument of the government in this case is that the delegations have been properly made down to the people who implemented the process for preparing the plan of management and then running it through the consultation process and up to the minister. So the reference to secretary is the Secretary of the Department of Planning and Environment. And of course, this is where the whole thing is very confusing, because that is the same secretary who's responsible for the decisions under the Environment Planning and Assessment Act, the development and project decisions. But in this case, it's the secretary in wearing the hat of Environment Secretary who passes the decision process up to the Minister for Environment, not for the Minister for Planning.
Okay. Thanks. Now, a question from Dave Darlington, stalwart of Kosciusko National Park. Which I think I'm going to hand to you, Ted, which is asking if an underground option was adopted, can the easement actually be revegetated, or does it need to remain entirely bare? And Ted, perhaps you could sort of touch on the disturbance footprints of the 3 different underground options in your answer.
Thanks, Gary. Yeah, well, as Gary said, there's 3 methods of undergrounding transmission lines: trenching, horizontal directional drilling, and tunnelling. Trenching is the most impactful as far as the environment is concerned, because you've got to dig a hole, put the cables in and fill it back up again, and then you maintain an easement over that cable for the life of the cable. You can grow grasses, you can, if it's in an agricultural area, you can crop, but you can't grow big trees with roots that might interfere with the cables. And you have to also maintain some sort of access way along the cable for the very infrequent times you need to get there to fix it. And the easement width depends on how many circuits, but typically for this case, it would be 15 to 20 metres wide. So that would be a cleared easement. But from the surface perspective, all you would see would be cleared land. Horizontal directional drilling is drilling a hole horizontally, and typically these would go 1 kilometre or so, come to the surface, have a joint bay, and then connect another length of 1 kilometre along. So you'd have nothing between those joint bays. You don't really need an easement. You would just have those joint bays, which are quite small in size, but they would be visible above the ground. Tunnelling, in our view, in this case, is the most appropriate. So you just have a tunnel from, in this case, effectively from the underground power station all the way to the Maragal substation in Bago State Forest. So you've just got an entry area for that tunnel, typically 5 or 6 metres diameter, much smaller than the water tunnels, which are 11 metres diameter. and then the main environmental impact is disposal of the soil from the excavation. So in that case, there's no surface impact whatsoever. The land looks exactly the same as what it is, and in some cases the tunnel would be very deep anyway, so it has no impacts whatsoever. So that's what we've said was appropriate for Snowy 2. And as I mentioned, the first 3 kilometres of that connection from the power station to Mooragle is in the underground tunnel coming to the surface at Rob's Hole anyway.
All right, and look, I'm going to exercise the MC's prerogative and direct a question to my 2 fellow panel members. One of the claims that we've seen in the submissions by Transgrid and others to the Upper House inquiry is, of course, that undergrounding takes too long. Can't possibly afford the time to, do the extra planning and the extra construction. Ted, in particular, I wonder if you could just reflect on that assertion, given the timeline for Snowy 2, which has stretched from, I think, originally to be pumping power in 2024, and we now know that there'll be sometime in the next decade. Do you think it's an unreasonable ask to put in place the planning and extra construction time that's going to be required for an underground option?
Well, I guess our first point is the plan of management required undergrounding, and that should have been the basis on which the business case for Snowy 2 was determined in the first place. The time frame for Snowy 2, actually, the initial time frame was 2021. The feasibility study, I think, extended that to 2023, 24. The time frame has been moved and it's about to be extended again 5 times over the period, and the completion date is always 6 years hence. So it seems to be a rolling period of 6 years hence the project will be completed. The latest official date is 2029, but that will be extended shortly, we understand. So it's not going to be completed until the 2030s. This is just a ginormous and very complex project in a very difficult location to access and quite a difficult location to work in. That's the realities, and clearly it was underestimated substantially from the start. Undergrounding does take more time. There's no question about that. But there is more than enough time between now and 2030 to design and construct and build an underground tunnel. All we're talking about is 9 kilometres. It's not that large. There's 40 odd kilometres of tunnelling in the Snowy 2 project itself, of which 6 has been done. So they've still got 34 kilometres to go, and that's not going to be completed until next decade anyway. So there is sufficient time, in our view, to do that. And if it had been planned from the get-go, well, then the tunnel, provided the tunnel boring machine was a better performer than Florence, could have almost been completed by now.
Thanks, Ted. Look, everybody, we've just ticked over our 7 o'clock time, and I do want to be respectful of your time. I need to once again thank Bruce, Ted, Sam, James, and everyone involved in pulling together tonight's presentation. But most importantly, when I look through the list of people who are present tonight, I need to thank so many of you individually and as a group for the expertise, assistance, financial support that so many of you have provided. We know we are far from the only people who care about this issue and care about Kosciusko. It is incredibly energizing to see your names and know that you're joined in a common purpose around this. I just want to thank everybody so much for your assistance. And I also need to say that this is, we are more than 5 years into this. We are really determined in the action we're taking. Bruce, Ted, and I are available to talk to anyone who wants to delve into this in more detail. This is absolutely an effort of an extraordinary community of people. And so please, if you want any more information, we will absolutely provide it. For those who are asking whether the information that's been presented tonight will be available, yes, it will. The whole webinar will be on the NPA website, and we'll also have links across to the video. But please pick up the phone and chat to us if there's anything else you want to talk about. And on that note, I'm going to thank everybody once again and close proceedings for tonight. Thank you all.